Hi gang! Today we are talking about our first sensory systems of the course, gustation, also known as taste. In each of our sensory systems, we're going to tackle 4 big questions. First, what is the stimulus? What is it that we're sensing? Then, how is that stimulus transduced and coded in the brain? How do we integrate that sense with other sensory systems? And how do our expectations or other sources of top-down information affect perception? You'll get a taste of the first 2 of these today, and we'll talk about the others next time. Okay, so first, in order for us to taste, what is happening? We talk about gustation as being a chemical taste, meaning that the stimuli that lead to perceptual experience are molecules. We call these stimuli tasteds. It's worth pointing out that taste is a really up close and personal sense, right? Unlike hearing or vision, you can't taste something that's across the room. In order for you to taste it, it has to be really close to you. It has to be actually in your mouth. So let's start by talking about why do we taste? What's the benefit of being able to taste? Each of the 5 tastes that you read about provide some information about nutritional quality or warn us about something being potentially harmful. If you're going to put something into your mouth, if you're going to have that up close and personal relationship with it, you should have some clues about whether it's going to help you or hurt you. So taste gives us information about the nutritional quality of what we're putting in our mouths. Some qualities signal good things that over the course of evolutionary history have been good for us, like calories, like substances that help us maintain electrolyte balance, the presence of proteins. Other tastants signal things that may potentially be harmful or poisonous. Now, one interesting thing about this is that the pleasant and aversive nature of tastes is hardwired. We are hardwired to like sweet tastes. There are lots of things we're hardwired to dislike, right? Pain, very bright lights, big loud noises. And many sensory experiences are more flexible and learned. We'll talk more about that as we go on. But the next time you eat a sweet treat, think about the fact that other than the sensations that code for sex, sweet taste is the only sensory experience that is hardwired for pleasure. So these tastes are useful for humans to be able to identify given our omnivorous diet. But other animals with different evolutionary pressures have evolved differently. So cats, for instance, don't have any sweet receptors. In evolutionary history, they just ate meat, smaller cats, so they didn't have pressure to be able to have taste receptors that could code for, delicious sweet berries or chocolate cake. That's probably why some of them are grumpy. They're missing out on hardwired pleasure of sweetness. And if you eat bamboo all day, you don't need receptors that code for protein. So there weren't evolutionary pressures for pandas to be able to code for umami, so they can't. All right, so at this point, it's important for us to distinguish between taste, what we have been talking about so far, and flavor. People often get tripped up on this, so listen up. Okay, taste is just the 5 qualities that we've talked about so far. Sweet, sour, bitter, salty, umami. But taste is a sensation that we rarely experience in isolation, because whenever you have food or drink in your mouth, your gustatory receptors are going to be activated, but the volatile chemicals, the volatile molecules in your food also make their way up the back of your throat into your nasal cavity and make contact with the olfactory or smell receptors in your nose. So a lot of what we experience as flavor is coming from our nose rather than our mouths. You can also tell if food is cold or creamy or crunchy, and those sensations are coded for by somatosensory or touch receptors. You can also even hear your food, right? You can hear as it crunches. And that isn't about taste at all, right? That's about the auditory system. And of course, the way that things look influence our perception of flavor as well. So taste is just coding for those 5 gustatory qualities, whereas flavor is this fully multi-sensory experience that incorporates lots of other sensory systems as well. So what that means is that in this class, when we talk about taste, we're talking about sweet, sour, bitter, salty, umami. But it is, for instance, illegal in this class to say that something tastes like orange or tastes like cilantro, because we don't have gustatory receptor cells that code for cilantro. Those are olfactory. That's happening in your nose. We also don't say that things taste spicy or taste creamy, because those are somatosensory or touch experiences. To demonstrate how much olfaction affects our experience of flavor, we'll do a little demonstration. Okay, To demonstrate the multisensory nature of flavor, I have a volunteer. It's Violet. Say hi, Violet.
Hi, gang.
She's quarantining with me, so it's okay that we're this close. Okay, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna give Violet a jelly bean out of this bag. She's gonna close her eyes and plug her nose. So at first, she's mostly just gonna be getting information about taste. I'm gonna see if she can identify the flavor of the jelly bean. She won't be able to. Then she's gonna unplug her nose and take a big deep breath so that those molecules from the jelly bean get up into her olfactory cavities. She can smell it too, and then the flavor will pop into focus. Okay, close your eyes, plug your nose. Okay. What do you taste?
Sweet.
Can you tell the flavor?
Not even a little.
Okay. Now unplug your nose. Big deep breath. What is it?
Orange.
Yeah! See? You need your nose to be able to experience flavor. We'll talk more about multisensory contributions to flavor next time, but first we have to cover how we go from the tastants to action potentials happening in the brain. So the action of this, of course, happens on the tongue. I'm going to show you a picture of a tongue now. There's your warning. The action of gustatory transduction happens in the fungiform papilla, which are the little visible dots on the surface of the tongue. People call those taste buds. They're not. Taste buds are tiny and contained within the fungiform papilla. So what you're seeing are those papilla. So within the fungiform papilla are taste buds, and within the taste buds are gustatory receptor cells. Lots of them. Now, in order for tastants to make contact with the gustatory receptor cells, they have to first dissolve in saliva. You can see that the cilia of the gustatory receptor cells are kind of nestled down in that taste pore, so they can't actually make contact with the tastants directly. So therefore, saliva is really important for carrying those chemicals deeper into the tongue in order to make contact with those taste receptor cells. To demonstrate the importance of saliva, I'm going to show you what happens if you don't have any. Hey, look, Violet's back.
Hi.
Okay, what she's going to do this time is dry off her tongue. So stick your tongue out and dry it off. We want no saliva on there. Yep, all the way dry.
Now, paper towel.
That'll work. Now, she's going to put the Ritz cracker, salty side down, on her tongue. What do you taste? Try again. What do you taste? Nothing. Nothing. She tastes nothing because there's no saliva to carry those tastants from the surface of the tongue into the taste pore. Okay, now you can just eat it. Okay, so sorry to gross you out, but anytime you're tasting anything, you're not actually just tasting the tastant. You're tasting your own saliva with the tastant dissolved in it. Okay, so how do we go from tastants in saliva to action potentials in cranial nerves? So here's a schematic of a gustatory receptor cell. The input end is up top, the output end is down here. There are the sodium and potassium channels that you're familiar with, as well as vesicles with neurotransmitters. So the process of transduction occurs in one of two ways. When salty or sour tastants make contact with the gustatory receptor cell, they enter the receptor directly through ion channels. Both Na+, which is coded as salty, and H+, which is coded as sour, are positively charged. That means when they enter the gustatory receptor cell, they bring their positive charge in with them and cause that cell to become slightly more depolarized. So that means that the salt in salty food is what actually causes the initial depolarization of the gustatory receptor cell. This is super cool. This is like the simplest form of transduction. The tastant is the initial depolarizing agent. So that slight depolarization causes voltage-gated sodium channels to open, which causes more sodium to enter the cell. The cell becomes more depolarized, and that ultimately leads to release of neurotransmitters and action potentials in that postsynaptic cell. For sweet, bitter, and umami tastants, the process is a bit different. So when those tastants make contact with receptors, they bind to the receptors, but they don't enter them directly. Instead, they cause second messengers, G proteins, to detach from the receptors. Those G proteins result in a chemical cascade that results in opening ion channels and triggering more depolarization. The particulars of the second messenger process are beyond the scope of this course, but the key takeaway is that tastants lead to depolarization either rapidly and directly by directly depolarizing the cell, in the case of salty and sour tastants, or via this slower, indirect mechanism for sweet, bitter, and umami tastants. In both cases, the end result is neurotransmitter being released by the gustatory receptor cell, leading to action potentials in the postsynaptic cell. Okay, so how do we know which of the 5 tastants is present at any particular time? You might think that some cells code for sweetness, some cells code for sourness, and so we can interpret which tastants are present just by the activity of individual cells. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because each type of gustatory receptor cell responds to multiple different types of stimuli. So here's a schematic of the firing rate of a neuron when presented with one of 4 different tastants. So I'm going to show you a few different types of neurons here. If we were to insert an electrode into the axon of this particular neuron and apply these different tastants, we see the biggest increase in firing rate for sweet tastants, but also some increase over baseline for salty and sour tastants as well. So we'd call a cell like this a sweet sensitive cell, a sweet gustatory receptor cell, because it's firing most robustly for sweet tastants. But it's kind of a misnomer to say it's a sweet sensitive cell, because it's actually responding over baseline to salty and sour tastants as well. If we look at another kind of cell, we could see that it responds most robustly to salty tastes, another to sour, and another to bitter. But for most of these, they're also responding with firing rates above baseline for multiple different tastants. So in order to interpret which tastant is present, we have to use the combined responses from lots of different types of gustatory receptor cells. So this coding scheme is called population coding. It's the idea that our sensory experience of a stimulus is the result of combining the signals from multiple different neurons. This is a simplification. I'm not implying that there are actually only 4 different types, because there are in fact lots of different types of receptors that code for each particular taste quality. There are, for instance, over 30 receptors that code just for bitter tastes. But the idea is that in order for us to detect which tastants are present, we're using the combined response from many different types of gustatory receptor cells. At some point, you've probably come in contact with the classic tongue map, the idea that certain tastes are transduced only in certain regions of the tongue. This turns out to be a delightful mischaracterization of the truth, for a number of reasons. One is that we have just said that each gustatory receptor cell responds to multiple different types of stimuli. So the bitter receptors we just saw fire for salty tastes as well as bitter ones, meaning that we must be able to detect the presence of salty tastes in those regions where it says bitter. The other thing that's wrong with the tongue map is that the different types of gustatory receptor cells, that is, those that respond most robustly for sweet versus salty, are in fact distributed across the tongue. You have all of the kinds of receptors everywhere. Oh, also, where's umami? It's missing umami. So where did this common misconception come from? In 1901, a PhD student in Germany dripped different solutions of tastants all over people's tongues and found some small, we're talking real small, sensitivity differences for different regions of the tongue. So it may be that you can detect the presence of H+ at a slightly lower concentration on the sides of the tongue than you can, for instance, in the middle. 40 years later, an American translated this original German paper and made some mistakes in the translation. He misinterpreted those tiny sensitivity differences as meaning that those regions of the tongue are solely responsible for coding for particular types of tastants. So that mistranslation of the original paper has led to this persistent misconception. Okay, so we've talked about how gustatory transduction typically operates. However, there are situations in which this typical process can be altered. You read about miracle berries, which contain that substance called miraculin that can hijack the typical process of taste transduction. So miraculin binds to sweet receptors just as sugar would, but it doesn't cause the G proteins to be released from those sweet receptors. At least it doesn't at normal pH. But in the presence of acids, when H+ is present in sour foods, that leads to the G proteins becoming detached from that sweet receptor, causing that enzymatic cascade that ultimately leads to depolarization. So what that means is that miraculin is binding to the sweet receptors, but only activating them in the presence of sour tastants. So that means that biting into a sour lemon gives the taste of intense sugariness. The scent of lemon is still the same, so it still seems like a lemon, it just seems like a super sweet lemon. This has led people to do things like have flavor tripping parties in which they eat miracle berries and then eat an assortment of very sour, but now perceptually sweet foods. The miraculin stops binding to the receptors after about 30 minutes and the experience stops. Warm foods and liquids also denature the miraculin and also cause it to stop working. The danger is that even though miraculin changes the experience of taste on the tongue, eating lots of super acidy foods can still hurt your tummy. So proceed with caution. The name flavor tripping makes it sound like miracle berries are a drug, but unlike a drug, the action of miracle berries is happening on the tongue, not in the brain. Even if you've never had miracle berries, you've likely had another experience in which the receptors of your tongue are activated differently than usual that leads to the same kind of flavor tripping, but in a much less pleasant way. I'm talking about when you brush your teeth and then drink orange juice. So when you brush your teeth and then drink orange juice, the orange juice tastes terrible. The reason for this is that toothpaste contains something called sodium lauryl sulfate, which is a foaming agent. It helps the toothpaste get all bubbly and spread throughout your mouth. It works great for that, but the downside is that it suppresses or blocks receptors in the gustatory receptor cells that code for sweet tastes. So even if sweet tastes are present, they don't get coded for. Sodium lauryl sulfate also breaks apart fatty molecules on the tongue called phospholipids. Normally, phospholipids reduce our experience of bitter tastes. They're actually used as additives in some bitter medicines to make them taste less bitter. But when sodium lauryl sulfate breaks down those phospholipids, you get enhanced bitter taste. So the sourness and the bitterness of orange juice are always there, but because toothpaste reduces the sweetness and amplifies the bitterness, you get that nasty taste. So it's why you are unlikely to see anyone actually manufacture these kinds of foods. All right, so once the tongue has coded for the presence of different types of tastants, we have to get that information up to the brain. Action potentials generated in gustatory receptor cells are carried up cranial nerves to the brainstem. They relay in the thalamus and then make their way to primary gustatory cortex. The taste pathway is somewhat unusual in that it's primarily ipsilateral, meaning that information from the right side of your tongue is primarily coded in right gustatory cortex. So primary gustatory cortex, or primary taste cortex, is located in the insula and codes for our basic low-level experience of taste, basically saying, is that sweet or is that sour? And one of the ways that this distinction is made is through what are called gustatopic maps. It's the finding that particular regions of gustatory cortex respond most robustly to particular types of tastants. So this is a schematic from a paper that was using a mouse model in which they recorded activity, used electrodes to record activity from particular regions of gustatory cortex while the mouse was administered specific tastants. And what they found is that one region of gustatory cortex responded the most robustly to sweet tastants, and one region responded most robustly to sour tastants, and so forth. So it seems that these different sensory qualities are actually coded in physical space, mapped out in primary gustatory cortex. Isn't that cool? Okay, so in addition to evaluating just which taste quality, which of the 5 tastes is present, we also do some processing of how we feel about those tastes. That is, how much we like them, this hedonic value of the tastes. That happens primarily in orbitofrontal cortex. So primary gustatory cortex is coding for which tastes are present, and orbitofrontal cortex is coding for how much we like or enjoy those tastes. Okay, so what do we do with miracle berries other than, enjoy them? Miracle berries can be useful for people with diabetes or anyone who wants to restrict calories and limit their sugar intake. So restaurants have started marketing miracle berry desserts as a way to get the pleasure of sweets without the calories. So you have like a bite of a miracle berry and then plain yogurt with lemon juice, and it's like the most amazing lemon cheesecake you've ever had. All right, for number 2. So the researchers in this study were doing neuroimaging using magnetoencephalography while giving people precisely timed squirts of different kinds of liquid, and looking at the timing between when the squirt happens on the tongue and when primary taste cortex is responding to that tastant. So you see that the sour tastants are being coated in gustatory cortex faster than the sweet ones. And this happens because remember that the H plus that is coating, the H plus that leads to our experience of sourness is directly entering the cell, whereas sweet tastes are coated through that system using G protein coupled receptors, meaning that sweet tastants just take longer to coat. So the interesting question is, what happens when you experience something sweet via miracle berries? You eat a miracle berry and then have something sour. How does that time course work? And it turns out that the sensation from sour after miraculin follows the time course of just having something sweet. So you put lemon juice on your tongue after miracle berries, and it's coated in the brain in a similar time course to if you just were to put sucrose on the tongue. The other neat thing about this study is that they also recorded activity in cortex, in primary taste cortex, in physical space, and found additional evidence for these gustatopic maps in humans. So they showed that the regions of the brain that are responding to citric acid after miracle berries are more similar to the regions that are activated when you have something sweet. In fact, having citric acid after miracle berries is more like having sugar in terms of how and when it's coated in the brain than citric acid without miracle berries and citric acid with miracle berries. So it's a really neat demonstration of the fact that perception depends on more than just the stimulus. Number 3, picky eating. So every time we eat something and we don't die, we learn that that's a safe thing to eat. But every time you eat something new that you've never eaten before, you're risking it. Right? I know this apple is safe because I've eaten apples before, but cauliflower? I haven't had that before. That's new. Maybe it will kill me. So being averse to new foods means that you're less likely to be unintentionally poisoned. Kids are particularly sensitive to bitter tastes, perhaps to help them avoid eating poisonous foods. As we get older and seeing others eating new foods and not dying, we gradually learn that most things you can buy at the grocery store aren't going to poison you. That aversion to newness seems to diminish. But it's really to kids' advantage to limit the kinds of things that they want to eat in order to make sure that they're only eating things that are safe. Sometimes when I'm at the table with my kids, one of them will say, "Mama, I want your toast." And I'll say, "It's exactly the same as your toast." And they'll say, "But Mama, I want your toast." And so rather than being annoyed at them for, eating my toast, I try to remind myself that it's actually a very wise evolutionary adaptation to only trust things that you've eaten before or that you've seen other people eat. We talked about neural adaptation in the unit on neuroanatomy and action potentials, and this is a really nice example of adaptation in action. So normally when you eat cake, your sweet-sensitive gustatory receptor cells are firing the most robustly. So here we see firing rate, and you see the largest number of action potentials, the fastest rate of action potentials is for those sweet-sensitive cells. But as you keep eating cake, those sweet-sensitive cells adapt. All of the cells might adapt somewhat, but we typically see the most adaptation for the neurons that have the highest firing rate. So the first bite of something is usually the sweetest, or sourest, or saltiest that it's ever going to be. Okay, so you eat cake and those sweet receptors adapt. Now, when you drink lemonade, lemonade has both sour tastants and sweet tastants in it. And so typically we'll see an increase in firing rate for both the sweet sensitive cells and the primarily sour sensitive cells. But if you have just eaten cake and the response from those sweet cells is reduced, now the response for lemonade is a higher firing rate for the sour sensitive cells than for the sweet ones. So what would typically taste sour and sweet is tasting more just sour. So the higher firing rate of the sour gustatory receptor cells are consistent with that more sour taste. All right. That's it for today. Tune in next time to learn more about why different people like to eat different things, how taste is affected by other senses, and how our expectations affect what we perceive. See you next time.